Hi there, my name is Sandy Allnock. Welcome to my YouTube channel. That's my kitty Punch behind me. And we are here today to bring you the Straight Skinny on artist and adult coloring books. These have really taken the world by storm. There have been a couple of major articles in large newspapers about how coloring relaxes people, and they're taking to it in droves. These coloring books are ones that I purchased and wanted to test and share some information with you guys, but as I've posted them on social media, I've had tons of questions about them, and that's what this video is going to hopefully answer. It's really long, really long, and I'm going to put annotations right here so that if you want to skip ahead to a different section, you can do that. Or there's also timestamps listed in the description down below if the annotations don't work for you. Now for the FAQ, I get a lot of questions about the quality of the paper. How thick is it? Does the color go through to the back? Can you use watercolor on it? Will my paper warp? Is the color light fast? Can I frame it? And on and on and on. And the answer to the majority of these questions is these are just coloring books. And I think as artists and crafters, we're putting high expectations on a little book. These books range from $5 up to $17. They are not high-priced books. If you think of a pad of paper, it's going to cost that much for less sheets, and these are printed on. There's no way that these are going to hold up to every medium you want. They're not going to be on heavy paper. There's some that are slightly heavier than others, but they're not going to be on watercolor paper, so your techniques are all going to be completely different that you use with all of your mediums. I haven't found any that I'm satisfied with thus far with Copic markers. I've colored some with Copics, but I haven't done any blending with them. And yes, they do go through the back on most of these coloring books because it's cheap paper. It's not meant to be colored with this. They are made for people who use their colored pencils or crayons from their kids' craft room or from the grocery store. They're not intended for people like us. So you need to take that into consideration and relax. It's just something fun to color and a fun way to spend some time chilling out with some color. For me, the only learning I ever get from any of my coloring in these books is learning how to choose colors. I try different colors next to each other, and I try some really ugly colors next to each other just to see what they look like. I may not try that on a project, but I'll be willing to try it on a cheap piece of paper in a coloring book. I also play with patterns and Zentangling and other fun things that I may use eventually in another project, but I don't consider any of these anything that I would frame. I don't look at these as finished pieces of art, and I hope you won't either, unless you do something that's amazing and you want to frame it. That's great. But most of your markers as crafters are not going to be light fast. So if you end up framing something and it starts to fade while it's hanging in the light, then all you have to do is change it out for another page later. This is not expensive stuff. It's not going to be artist quality stuff, and you're going to just have to get used to that idea when you think of these coloring books. So I want to just set those realistic expectations for everybody before you dive into your coloring books. Now, what I do suggest that you do is pick a coloring book that has images that inspire you. I have some in here that are very whimsical and silly images, and they have lots of little tiny places to color. Others have big wide open spaces, and they're elegant illustrations by professional illustrators. There's a whole variety here of all different styles, and I'm going to do a flip through of the entire collection so you can see what kind of images they are. So buy a book that has images that excite you, and then sit down and test it. I'm going to show you my method for testing with some mediums that I will show you, and I'm not being exhaustive in all the mediums that I show by any means. I'm just going to show you some to get you started, and then do your testing. Find out what techniques work. Try different things. Try applying the color in different ways with different other mediums. There are some people that will cover the entire thing in some sort of gesso or mixed media type of substance, and they're happy with that. For me, I find that to be too much work to put into a coloring book page. I would rather put that much effort and supplies into an actual finished art project. But if that's what you want to do in your coloring book, that's up to you. But pick a book with images that excite you and try that to get started. And don't worry about things going through the back. Just put a sheet of paper in between to save the following page. and get started. Don't stress about it. It's supposed to be relaxing and fun. So I'm going to start out by flipping through all the books and show you what I've got here. Let's get started.
They say hindsight's 20/20, but I can't turn back the clock. We said everything even though we never talked, but I heard you loud and clear, all the pain inside your heart. It was written on your face every time you dropped your guard. Ooh. Letting go, open road, left everything behind me. There's no future in the past that's gonna last. Headlights on, rearview mirror gone. 'Cause even though I know you're still there, I've gotta get out of here fast. And no, I won't look back. We didn't speak the same language that we once did. And we wanted more than we were willing to give. We tried everything that didn't make sense. Tried it every day, but we could not pretend. Ooh. Letting go, open road, left everything behind me. There's no future in the past that's gonna last. Headlights on, rearview mirror gone. 'Cause even though I know you're still there, I've gotta get out of here fast. And no, I won't look back. They say hindsight's 20/20, but I can't turn back the clock. We said everything even though we never talked, but I heard you loud and clear, all the pain inside your heart. It was written on your face every time you dropped your guard. Ooh. Letting go, open road, left everything behind me. There's no future in the past that's gonna last. Headlights on, rearview mirror gone. 'Cause even though I know you're still there, I've gotta get out of here fast. And no, I won't look back. We didn't speak the same language that we once did. And we wanted more than we were willing to give. We tried everything that didn't make sense. Tried it every day, but we could not pretend. Ooh. Let
So let's start by talking about mediums. The medium that is most obvious for coloring books is crayons. You can totally use crayons. Just get yourself a good sharpener so you can get some nice sharp points on them. Colored pencils are another one that works on pretty much every coloring book. They're going to work on everything, so you can get a set of those. Then we have regular watercolor pencils. So these are not the Inktense pencils, but the regular ones. I have the Prima brand, but you can use any brand of watercolor pencils. Try them, and you'll have to try them with different amounts of water. I'll show you how that works. These are the Inktense pencils, and once these are dry, the pigment in them is not able to move with water, so you can't re-wet them. So there's some things that those are good for, and some things that the regular watercolor pencils are good for. Then we get into markers. This one is a Tombow marker, and these are one of the ones that are my favorites for most of these coloring books because I think they work pretty much the best. But there's also distress markers. You can test those out, and you can test out the Marby markers. One of the very cool things about these is the size of the tip. And I'll show you the size of each of these nibs, and you can see the difference in how thin you can get because these Marbys have a nib like that. And I think that's a pretty special thing to do when you're working on a lot of detail. Okay. Next we have the Zig Clean Color pens, and what I do is pick two colors when I'm going to do my testing so I can see how they blend into each other without water, and then I'll test them also with water. Then I have some Copic multi-liner pens. Now we're getting into a little more expensive here. These multi-liner pens come in these packs. At least I get them in these packs. And they have a brush one and a 0.3 in all these different colors. So it's another option for you that you can do really fun things with these markers, but they are Copic multi-liners, so you can use your Copics alongside of them and the ink won't bleed. Next up is this Staedtler FINELINE pen. And it comes in a pack like this. There are different sizes and stuff, but these are just very, very fine point markers. And you can see they have a very, very thin point. And I'll do some testing with those. And then I always pick two colors of Copic marker so I can see how they blend from a light to a dark. And then any watercolors you have. Whatever brand of watercolors you have, you can test those too, and I'll show you some ideas. I always have a pen on hand, some sort of a writing pen, so that I can write down on a sticky note which mediums I liked best or any notes about that coloring book, and I put it on the inside cover so I can find it again. I have a block, or you can have a palette or something if you're going to use any watercolor techniques with any of these guys. And then you can use either a water brush or a regular paintbrush. You don't have to have a high-end paintbrush. I use the silver brushes because they get a very fine point, and I like that. I generally don't use these guys on coloring books because they put out so much water, and it's really difficult to control, especially when you're working on paper that's not watercolor paper. So you can use this, just know that you could end up wrinkling your paper more because you're putting down more water than you need. Whenever I test a coloring book, I look through the book to figure out which one is my least favorite image out of all of them. And I looked through this one and I opted for this guy. Not a big fan of this bird in particular, so I'm going to get that one ready. This book in particular has little perforations so you can tear the page out. And what I'll do is color every section with one of the mediums. And here we have crayon, colored pencil. And with colored pencil, I look for how it feels on the page. Some of them are slicker than others. So see what it is that you like as you do your coloring. Now let's get into some of the watercolor pencils. This is one of the Primas. And just going to color along one edge, because with watercolor pencils, you'll just, color some color on there. And I'm going to do the Inktense at the same time, so we get the brush out once and do both. This will be the Inktense pencil. This is the one that stays put once it's dry. So I'm going to color one of each section, and I'll take a brush that's damp. I pulled most of the water off with my finger so that I don't have a soaking wet brush. The wetter it is, the harder time you're going to have with the paper getting all funky. And if you can go over it in fewer strokes and get it to blend, then that's great. So you can see both of these color pencils worked pretty well. This one is the Prima, and this one is the Inktense. And I'm going to dry this because I want to try something with the Inktense to see if it works. Inktense pencils, once they're dry, and of course now that I've wet it and heat dried it, I did get some floppiness to the paper, so that's another thing to remember. That's one of the reasons that I tend to keep my sample sheets in the book if I think I might be curious about how that's going to work in the future, so I remember whether or not it got floppy. But I'm going to paint right over this with another color and let it be a wash right over the green. It's not going to move the green. It'll just layer over top of it so you get a red and a green. But I am getting a little bit of pilling. But the pilling is kind of interesting. I mean, I like the look of that. I think that could be a fun way to color a full page and get some interesting texture on it. Let's move over to some watercolor pens. This is the Tombow. And in general, it seems to me the Tombows have worked best for me in terms of working on coloring books. I usually do a section that I'm going to watercolor, and then I'll take a large section and try to see whether or not I can do it without getting that, which is where you start layering colors over top of each other and they end up doubling that and they start looking pilly and strange. But on this particular paper, the Tombow is not moving the way I would normally like it to move. But I can also watercolor it by coloring some on a block or a piece of plastic, all different kinds of ways, and I'll get a light purple, and I can watercolor with a light purple. Again, you don't want to use much water. You want it to be very soft, but you'll never get that intense purple by doing it this way, just so you know that. I'll try the same thing with distress markers. I'll just do a large line to watercolor along and then see how this does in terms of coloring a large area. And get my damp brush, and you can see the color moving just a little bit. Doesn't move a ton, and you don't want to scrub too much or you're going to end up with the paper pilling. But you can also take the pen, draw on the block, and then get a pinkish color to paint with. And different brands of marker will hold different amounts of color. So some of them you'll find are going to be more intense, and sometimes just the color itself will be more or less intense depending on how the marker color was formatted and how it was made. So this is Distress. Now let's look at the Marvy pens. This is the Marvy Le Plume pens, the ones that have the really tiny line nib. And I'll just color to see how a solid area goes. For the most part, I'm not really pleased with any of them in terms of just coloring solid, because I've been coloring with my Copics so long that I'm very used to how they work and how they blend. So this is the Marvy. And I can get a watercolor wash. Then we have the Zig Clean Color pens, and I have two colors, so I can try seeing what the two colors blend like. On many papers, these two will blend without any water whatsoever. You just color over top of the lighter color, or the darker color with the lighter color. And you get some blending here, not a ton. It gets a little funky texture. I want to try it with just the water to see what happens with the water. And then I'll get some here on my block to watercolor with in the same way as I tested everything else. So let's try that. And now let's try to see if we can move it here. Does not move a ton, a little slight pink. I'm going to jump over and try some regular watercolors. See how regular watercolors work. Let's go for this color here. Depending on your watercolor technique, If you want colors to blend into each other and all that sort of thing, you're going to need to do a few different things in order to get them to work well. I tried little water here and a lot of water here. You can see I get a lighter color. I'm also going to get more warping on the paper, but I can get that lighter color. And you can also dab off if you get too much liquid. But you don't here seem to get a lot of smoothness. So you'd have to play with your paper and your paints to see if you can get a soft edge on things. And now we'll do the Copic markers because I want to see how they go in terms of how they blend. So I'm taking a light yellow and a darker yellow. And I want to see how they mix together. Sometimes you'll need to wait and see what they're like when they dry, as with anything. And these are alcohol based, so they will not work with water. And the last couple pens we'll look at, this is the Staedtler Triplus Fine Liner. And if you want to add all kinds of detail to an image, these are great to do that with. Same with the Copic multi-liners. This one is the 0.3. And here we have the brush multi-liner. You can continue this with mediums ad nauseum and then write down on your piece of paper, on your sticky note, which ones you liked best. And so one of the things I love on this is the Prismacolor and the Zigs. They are on just about every list that I have because I like both of them on almost all of these papers. The Copic is interesting. I want to test more. And the Tombow and Distress and Marvy with water and the block. Those seem to work fairly well. And I think these I'm going to put on all the lists as well because you can always add detail. And then we look at the back just to see what happens here. You look for warping to see whether or not a lot of water warped it, and here we've got some spots from where the water made a mess of it, if that's an issue for you. Some of the watercolor and the water-based markers came through and the Copic came through. But if you put a piece of paper in between, I've got a piece of cardstock I just leave in the book so that it's always there and ready anytime I want to color. So then I put my list on the inside of my coloring book, and whenever I color a page, I take a small sticky note and I put the medium on the small sticky note on that page or on the back of it, so I always remember what I colored it with. Now this one I want to test because it's on much heavier paper than a lot of the others. So I'm going to try the Prima watercolor pencils and the Inktense pencils. And these break down much easier than on the last paper. So this is much heavier paper and the surface is a little thicker and feels a little less like a coloring book. And we'll see if the colors mix over top of each other or if we start getting some pilling from our orange color. So we do get some good breakdown on this. But you can again get some interesting mix of color without that green moving. A little bit of each one of these. We'll do a solid line and a watercolor line. Tombow, solid, and watercolor, and Distress. The Distress feels a little different than the others in how it goes on. It didn't glide across the surface nearly as easily as the other colors. But let's see how they do as colors that break down with water. That seems to do fine. Seems like everything is going to break down much better on this paper than in the other. And let's try a little bit of straight up watercoloring with these colors from a palette. And again, those seem to work just fine. Let's try the zig markers and see how they do. You take the lighter color, go right over the darker. Seems to blend fairly decently. And then blend out the color on the other end. And that does seem to break down as well. Let's jump over and try the Copic markers and see how that does. I can get any blending. Very minimal blending, but it did work better than on the last one. And then let's try one little bit of Koi watercolor. And that seems to go on fine. But it dabs off very, very light as well, so I got a lot of that water off. Let's look at the back and see how this goes. None of the other markers went through except the Copic. So Copic seems to be the only one that bleeds through, but these are one-sided pages. This is the Color Me Stress Free book, and I was really curious about it because it's got all these really interesting chapters and pages and things on the backs of them and stuff, and I was curious what would happen. So here are my color tests. The Prima and the Inktense did okay, not great, but okay. Tombow is better with, as they all seem to be, with the palette technique around the outside. Copic is a so-so. The zigs are only so-so in terms of blending from one color into another, but they work fine with water. And on the back of this, you'll notice the Copic does come through. Some of the Tombow and Marvy comes through. This page is the Secret Garden book, and I wanted to show you what happens when you put watercolor on this. You do end up, if you try to do a large area, getting this kind of pilling texture. If you keep going over it, it kind of goes away, but not a ton. And that seems to happen with all of the different types of watercolors that you would put on it. Let me try some of the Koi, and it does the same thing. This surface is just slick, and it's going to work better with dry mediums. The watercolor pencils and the zigs seem to be okay without water. Another thing that happens with the Secret Garden book is the pages do warp with water. And if you want to use the other side, you don't want to use any wet mediums because you will get a bunch of this kind of little page warping going on. This one is the Art Therapy Stained Glass book, and it's the one with the super hard cover. The watercolor pencils here did blend nicely. The Tombows kind of started blending when I used direct to paper, but all of these worked much better when they were on the block. And the zigs were a little tough to do the blending with, but they're interesting enough that I think you could certainly try them in this book. And Copic is, as always, kind of in the middle, but Copic is the only one that bled through on this book. Now let's take a look at the Pepin books. These are by far my favorites out of all of the coloring books that I have tried so far, and that is because of the surface of this paper. You can probably see it's got a different texture than everything else. The rest are basically coloring book paper. And I like something that's a little more artsy, and we'll do some of the Tombow. Let's see what it looks like. This you can kind of not get lines when you color with it, so you could color solid. Seems to work pretty well. Let's try the same with the Distress. And these feel a little funnier. You know, distress markers, if you've ever tried them, when they go on a piece of paper, they just feel rougher. And then we have the Marvies. And not as smooth a blend. The Tombows seem to be the best with that particular technique. So let's start putting some water on a few of these and see what happens. Again, this is very thin paper, so you don't want much water on it. And Inktense kind of breaks down. Takes a little work to do. I try to make sure I dab off excess anytime I use any kind of water on these papers because it's only 90-pound paper. 90-pound paper is not going to hold up nearly as well. The Prima seems to break down a little faster than the Inktense, so it's going to be a little easier to work with. See how the end of the Tombow blends out. And going direct to paper is going to work because you're going to get that color pulling all the way down. Distress breaks down. You see the difference between how these papers work and why I like them is because the colors work more like they do on art papers than they do on the other books that we've been looking at. And then the Marvies. Let's do this section with the Tombow. We'll do this piece with Distress. I'm just using the writing end of each one of these. And in these books, since the lines are gray, if you put a really, really thin line like this down there, you're going to end up being able to break down almost all of that color. And you can leave a little line there, or you can just make a wash out of it without having to use a block. Just color along the edge of that shape and you can blend it completely. Distress doesn't work as easily as the Tombow. And let's see what the Marvie does. Breaks down beautifully. Let's look at the Zig pens. These are another one that I've been using extensively in these books. And they blend very nicely from one color to another. You can blend all kinds of colors that don't go together using the Zig markers. And if you get colors that have extra color from the other pen on the nibs, just scribble them off. And you can get a very nice blend there as well. And let's do a real quick test here with Copics. The surface feels rough under the marker. And try to pull color in between. Does not blend. Very, very little, and it would take a lot of work to do that. These are also really large pages. Most people are not going to want to use up all their Copic ink on pages like this. Now another way to test is to just go forth and do. This is the Animal Kingdom book, and I'll flip through a few of the ones that were done here. This one is all in colored pencil. This was done by my friend Elizabeth when we were at the airport waiting for our chance to get back home from Alaska. And then we have this one, which was me doing colored pencil, and it's not quite finished yet. Back here, we have an entire page done in Copic, but look what happens to the back. You need to be able to sacrifice the back if you're going to do the front. So Copic does work. It doesn't blend very much at all on here. There were a few spots where I tried it, so solid color Copic would be all I would do here. In the Secret Garden book, I did this one, and this was in regular watercolors. It was my Holbein watercolors, and here was where I discovered I had way too much water on it, and I was using the water brush, the aqua brush, and it has the whole back of the page completely wrinkled up and a mess. But I did have fun painting it anyway, so it was still an interesting thing to do. And this is a page that was done in Copic markers, and it was done with lots of dots in the background, a little bit of light wash of color. A lot of this was layered blending, and it worked great. But again, notice you lose the back page. You have to just be willing to sacrifice that if you want to use your Copics in a book like this. This page was done in Marvie markers. So these are the Marvie Le Plumes, and I didn't use any water. I just used straight up color, and nothing went through the back. Now this is a piece that was all done in Inktense Pencils. So I would color with the Inktense pencil and then use water over it. And I could layer colors, so I did some flesh tones in here, and then over top of that I did some peaches and some browns to try to build up some muscles on her. Here. This one is in the Japanese Designs book, and I did this entirely with Tombow pens. So in some of these small areas, what I did was take that brown pen all the way around the outside edge and then watercolor up to it. And then I took brown pen there, all those different areas, and watercolored into each spot. This one is from the Arabian Patterns book, and it also was done with Tombow markers. And I ended up taking each one of those little shapes and drawing lines partially around it. I didn't go all the way around, so on these stars I just did a little bit on the tip, and then I scribbled a little lighter brown on the inside and then blended them. This one is from the Turkish Designs book, and I used the Marvi La Plume pens, and you can tell that because these lines are so tiny. Every single line is thin. I traced around the outside edges and then watercolored into them. Some of them I had used thicker lines, so I used the brush nib, and then most of them I used the thinner lines. And on some of these I even added hash marks in there to just add some texture to those open areas. This one is from the 1960s book, and it has been started but not finished. It has Zig Clean Color pen, and it's all Zig Clean Color pens, and they blend into each other, as you can tell, pretty nicely on this paper. And this is a section that I did in colored pencil, and it's very detailed. It takes a long time to do, so I haven't gotten back to it, but I do like the look of colored pencil on this paper. The Still Life Bouquets book was the first one that I got, and this was where I was first learning how to use the Zig Clean Color pens, and I just used all different kinds of colors to try to see what would blend with each other on this. Same here, this was all Zig Clean Color pen with no water except in this rose, and I was playing around with how much water I could get away with before it went off the rails, and I also used a little bit of water down here in the ribbon. Again, same kind of a deal, only the lightest areas and the lightest areas up in here have water. This was done by just striping different colors over top of each other and using that brush nib that those Zig Clean Color pens have to create some striations. And this one was done in another video that I'll link to you at the end of this one so you can see more of the coloring of this tulip. But again, Zig Clean Color pens work really great in these books. Now this is a book that I found in a national park. So you can find coloring books in other places that you can't find elsewhere. This one is not apparently available online anywhere, but of course when I was on some of my travels I had to get this book because it had this beautiful moose in it. So this was all done in colored pencil. So you can see the detail that you can get on something like this. I wish I could tell you where to get a book like this, but keep your eyes peeled when you visit zoos and parks and things because they often have really great animal art that you can color. So this is the India postcard book, and you can see how tiny the detail is here. Super, super tiny. So I had to use the writing nib of the Marvi pen to get just a little bit of color in there and then use some water with it. With these postcards, nothing comes through the back, but you might want to consider if you're going to put this through the mail, put some distress glaze over it before you send it, because that will protect it. You'll have to cover the entire surface of the entire card, or else it will look weird because it puts a shiny coat on the top of whatever you have. I also want to show you what I did in some of these hot off the press books, because I wanted to show you what's possible. This one was done with the Tombow markers, and they were on a block, so I scribbled on a block and then painted onto this. And I wanted to do it in kind of some vintage colors, so I just used blues and browns for this. And this one was done in the Zig Clean Color pens with no water. So you can get a watery look or a no watery look, and neither one seems to go through the back a ton. This one has a little bit more show through, but not a ton. This is one of my test pieces on one of the flower ones, and you can see the more intense color here, here, and this yellow, this really intense yellow, that was straight marker. And then I used marker on the block and picked it up and moved it over here and did the same thing with all those lighter areas so you can get a variation in color. When it got to this portion, I started layering colors over top of each other. I had a purple and a pink and a blue, And you can see you get a much nicer look when you do that kind of a thing. Now I wanted to bring to your attention these last two books. I don't have links for them as of yet, but I wanted to make you aware of them, that I am in this Birds and Butterflies book. I'll tell you where I'm at. I'm right here at the beginning. They have lots of examples on how you can Zentangle things, etc., and making your own designs. But here it has coloring basics, and here's Color by Sandy Allnock, which is fun. A friend of mine asked me if I would do this for this book, and so I did. Now, the problem is when she sent me this to color, I colored it on Nina cardstock because they sent me the digital stamp. And there are all kinds of mediums that are suggested in this book, and they're in a lot of different books. So I want to make you aware that when these things were colored, they were maybe not colored on this paper, okay? So know that when you see those kinds of things, when they say, oh, you could color it on this. But I did come up with something really fun in this particular book, and this is done with the Marvy La Plume pens. And what I did, since I wasn't getting really great coverage with them using the brush nib, I went in and did hash lines with the really tiny, narrow writing nib and made some interesting textures on it. There are so many different things that you can do in these coloring books. Just let your mind be a little bit free and don't think of it as a card. Don't think of it as finished art, but be still and know it's a coloring book. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you want to have a chance at winning one of the two of these books, because these two are mine, but I have two brand new ones that are not colored in to share with two lucky winners, go to my blog. Link is in the description down below, and I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.